Huge off-season additions continue to be shipped off. Why Slinky Dog was the real MVP and Aaron could be back this season? We've got all that and more. I'm Jason Fitz, and it is time for Inside Coverage. I'm Jason Fitz. He's Charles Robinson. She's Jori Epstein. They're Yahoo Sports senior NFL reporters. You know the drill. We're here as we are every single week for great, smart analysis on Inside Coverage, including... Can I just tell you the Toy Story broadcast was so good? I know, we got real stories to get to, but come on, just indulge me for a second, C-Rob, because I feel like maybe if I had to guess, like just picking things out of a hat, like I feel like you weren't at the top of the list of people doing cartwheels in the street to go watch the Toy Story broadcast, but I'm telling you, man, you missed out. Did you watch it?
I watched about 5 minutes. I'm not going to lie. I did watch about 5. It was too glitchy for me. I thought it was an interesting concept. I wasn't a big fan of the wide shot, where it was really far away. I'm like, I can't tell what the is going on when I'm watching this wide shot. Now, that said, I mean, I'm curious to see if they keep at this, how much better it can get. And I would like to know what the other applications are. This chip, and how they used it and embedded it and brought it to the table. I feel like there are probably other applications to this that maybe we're not seeing right now, but it was an interesting concept. I liked hearing fans say I watched it with my kids and my kids started asking me questions about football. It definitely gives you a window into the sneaky the NFL is trying to do to get football in the faces of younger fans and grow that next. By the way, that's what this is about. It's not about entertainment. This is about putting the candy in the checkout aisle of the store because you're trying to get little kids hooked on your product.
Yeah, I think it's so fitting that this is the week that we had both the Toy Story broadcast in the morning and then Taylor Swift and her star-studded ensemble at Sunday Night Football. And the NFL leaned into both because, like you said, that's where the room for growth is. The room for growth is not among these like middle-aged men who have been watching this for 20, 30 years of their life. It's among...
Which was that? I mean, we're both catching strays on this. Yeah. What happening, Jori?
But you guys are here, so you're not the room for growth, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Me personally, at this moment, I'm not the room for growth either because I'm here also. Anyway, but what I think is interesting when you talk about the other applications is that, Fitz, you made a good point before coming on, just when you think of some of like the all 22 lens that they were giving us into this broadcast, there are a lot of people who would love to watch an all 22 live broadcast, whether that was the main feed of the show or whether that was like an alternative broadcast on an ESPN2, ESPN Plus type thing. And I think to me, when I watch this Toy Story broadcast, it shows me they're capable of doing that. They may not want to, and the coaches certainly may not want them to, but that's really interesting. And then the last thing I'll say is like, to me, the Nickelodeon broadcast best part by far, no matter how many times they changed the other effects, was the slime. So I think this was really a question of like, is animated football fun without slime?
Slinky Dog made animated football fun without slime. Just to hear Drew Carter and Booger try and figure out when Slinky Dog was going to contract or expand was a delight. But I will say this, to Jori's point, I was kind of stunned at certain points in the game when they would go to the all 22 angle. I was like, why is it that I can better see who's open right now than I can watching the regular broadcast on Sunday? So I do think in a world, that's my big movie voice, in a world where we can do a Toy Story broadcast, part of the future of the NFL should be, how do we have a all 22 for diehards? And how do we have, a cool broadcast for kids? And how do we have a cool broadcast for teens? Like, I think we as this society, keep saying this, need to learn the phrase, like, not my thing, but cool. Like, because to me, that's ultimately like, hey, may not be my thing, but if a single kid fell in love with football because they watched the Toy Story broadcast, I'm all in on. I will. Story time. Just going to let you know, first time I'm in Nashville, I'm walking down Lower Broadway, 1997, I think it was, walking into this big Boots and More store, still there to this day on Lower Broadway. I walk in and I'm like, all right, I just moved here. I'm going into country music. I should get a toy store. I should get a hat, right? So I got a cowboy hat. I put it on. Sales guy all the way across the room says, hey, man, you look like Woody from Toy Story with that hat on. So I've been anti-Toy Story ever since. But I
can see that. I can totally see that. I absolutely can see that.
Nobody wants to be Woody. All right.
You look like Buzz Lightyear, Fitz.
Thank you. That's all I'm looking like. I got the tattoos. Like, come on. I'm more of an ass kicker than Woody ever was. Okay, fine.
But you know what else I think is notable here is when we talk about this all 22, I actually think that context of our conversation reminds me why that's probably not coming anytime soon. And that's because that's not going to bring new people into football. Like, I don't think the NFL is just trying to like win an Emmy or win some sort of award for what they can do. They want something that makes sense from a business standpoint. And that's also what I wonder when this is a one-off Toy Story thing rather than every week. How much are you actually picking up new you could probably pick up new advertisers for that specific game stream, but how much are you actually growing an audience if it happens once a season?
Well, and as somebody that, frankly, for an entire stage of my career, hosted a lot of stuff that was on ESPN Plus, right? Like, they're constantly trying to figure out not only what gets you there, but what keeps you coming in week after week after week. I don't think you could do a full season of Toy Story. It'd have to be Toy Story one week and Beauty and the Beast the next week and whatever. Like, a Bug's Life that. Like, it would have to be this wild like Disney World experience every single week. I think you're right about that. That at some point it is about, hey, not just what gets people here, but what keeps people wanting to come back over and over. See, Rob, is there an animated movie that you would watch as a football? I got to know. Like, is there something in the lexicon that would get you tuned into it?
An animated? No.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I'm too old. I am the worst. The NFL is like,
you guys weren't the audience. I told you.
Mid-40s. Like, that guy's locked in. We got no problem. He's coming back. Like,
he's not going anywhere no matter how much he wants to leave.
I would say, look, if there's a shelf life on Toy Story or the animated broadcast, if we only do that once a season, I would like if we could put a cap on the Taylor Swift end of it too. Like, can we? I think after listening to Travis Kelce, I think even Travis Kelce started to get sick of it. Let's see if we can also limit that end of it as well.
Let's see if we can shake it off and get to some of the actual news happening. You're welcome, America. I'm going to make it barf before we even get into this thing.
I will say, though, like, great move by her that she goes to one game in Kansas City and then, like, she lives in New York, so she didn't really have to go very far. She just brought all her friends and, like, went out for the night. Like, pretty smart timing.
Are we going to bring up that Jori tweeted a video of Taylor Swift? A lot of
famous people who I didn't recognize.
Taylor Swift is here. I'm like, Ryan Reynolds is like very prominently
Ryan Reynolds
featured.
and Hugh Jackman and Blake Lively, all of whom I've Googled since.
Yes.
My dad's like sending me Ryan Reynolds on Jimmy Fallon now, being like, this is when he and Will Ferrell switched places. I'm like trying to understand who these people are.
She was literally Googling Ryan Reynolds Fitz. She was Googling while I was texting her. She's like, I'm trying to figure out who this is.
Have you never seen Deadpool?
I have not. I hadn't even heard
Deadpool.
Of it before.
Come on.
Wait, but I literally
Jason.
didn't hear about like Deadpool. I never heard that before Sunday.
Jason, she was never Deadpool was not in the wheelhouse. I'm thinking like it's Ryan Reynolds, right? Like, I mean, that guy is objectively hot, right? Like, I mean, I can
objectively. Let me just be clear.
Smoking. Right?
Like, yeah. Anybody. It doesn't matter who you are. You're like, yeah,
my
I slept with Ryan Reynolds.
Knows
like, you go with that day one.
My mom knows who that is. Like, my mom doesn't know anything. And she knows who Ryan Reynolds is. I mean, come on. Jeez.
All right, we're going to move to some news because that's the real reason you guys are hanging out with us on the show. And we'll start with a little bit of Patriots news that actually impacts a couple of teams. Christian Gonzalez, Patriots rookie corner, out for the season with the torn labrum, which is unfortunate because he was actually having a monster, even for a rookie, he was having a monster year. So now there's every action has an equal and opposite reaction. J.C. Jackson, who remember was a surprise healthy scratch for the Chargers, has now been traded from the Chargers to the Patriots. And C-Rob, I'm trying to figure out here because I remember the chase for J.C. Jackson. Everybody was like, how much money is he going to get day one? What went wrong for him in the Chargers?
He was one of the worst coverage cornerbacks in the NFL. I mean, it was, now granted, he got hurt, right? Here's the thing about J.C. Jackson that was always interesting with the Patriots. He built into a complete starter into year 4, right? I think he started 11 games, year 3, year 4, he started 16, might have been 17 if that was the first year, 17 games. I know he started the full season for him, right? And a ton of interceptions. But when you talk to people about how J.C. Jackson played, he was a risk taker. He would take risks. Like there were times where, he was possible he was going to get burned because he was going for interceptions. He was going for big plays. And so at that time, it was like, okay, if he gets signed in free agency, the next team has to try to adjust out. I would call it the Marcus Peters element, right? Like Marcus Peters was always a super exciting player, but you could burn him because you knew he was going to go for the big play. You just had to bait him into it. And you needed to try to massage it and make him a more complete cover corner. So J.C. Jackson goes to the Chargers. He gets hurt in year 1, right? I think he only played 5 games. And then again, those injuries continued in a year too. But even in the short clip of time that he played there, he was bad. I mean, graded out very poorly as a coverage cornerback, and they signed him to be a coverage cornerback. The turnovers were great, but really what you were signing him for was because you're in a division with Patrick Mahomes, right? You're in a division with other quarterbacks that are projecting out. They're going to be throwing the ball. You got to be able to take a team's number one option off the table. It was not happening. And then I think the most telling point this season, when he was the healthy scratch, I mean, Brandon Staley came out and he mentioned preparation, I think twice, when he was talking about J.C. Jackson and why this guy wasn't where they needed him to be. There's only two phases of preparation really that you have to take care of, mentally and physically. So either you're not preparing for the game mentally, or you're not preparing for it physically, or you're doing neither. Remember, the healthy scratch came against the Vikings and Justin Jefferson. That is the player that you go get a J.C. Jackson for, right? Because you want to put him on a Justin Jefferson. I think the writing was on the wall just in how he was grading out the injuries. And then once Staley came out and talked about preparation, it was only a matter of time. And the Patriots are like, hey, another one of our guys who leaves the fold for a big free agent deal, fails, does not live up to expectations. And then we're going to go ahead and reel that player back in. I mean, it's crazy how they let assets, go off and they get their, third round compensatory pick, and then they reel them in later for, pennies on the dollar.
I think that's a good point. I think you also have to ask, the Chargers, the Broncos, the Raiders have all now released a player they signed in free agency in the last couple of years, trying to keep pace with Patrick Mahomes. And it's sort of like, when you feel that pressure of how can I keep up with a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes, are you making emotional decisions or logical decisions? Are you kind of really leaning into what is already just this free agency allure of someone that's not going to work? And also you have to ask a little bit, I think, what it says about Brandon Staley if he wasn't able to make it work for a guy like J.C. Jackson. And then, okay, I guess with the Patriots needing corner help, they're like, well, if we can get something for this guy who otherwise might not be working out and might not be worth a whole lot, you got to almost jump when that moment comes.
Yeah, but I love what you just said, though, about Staley, though. And let's be fair. I've been hard on Staley. I know that I'm hard on Staley. He's a defensive expert, right? So I would think going into free agency that the guy that's a head coach because of his great defensive mind would be able to look at the tape and say, yep, that's the guy that's worth a buttload of money, right? That's the guy right there that is worth all the cash. And then you can't make the most of them. It continues to make people say, well, why? I would get it if an offensive-minded coach whiffed on a defensive superstar because maybe that's not his area of expertise and he can pass the buck to player personnel, a professional personnel crew. But I don't know how Staley passes the buck on this. This is a huge – and to think that, to Jori's point, he's basically being acquired by the Patriots because the Patriots did the right thing. They drafted the guy. Christian Gonzalez looks like he's the guy. So they draft the guy gets hurt. Now they want to salvage something this season. They give up pennies on the dollar for somebody who's going to be paid by the Chargers, essentially. This just feels like one team is doing everything the right way and the other team is doing everything the wrong way.
But see, it's a blown draft pick. I mean, that's the way I look at this. It's like when we look at this in the draft process and we go, well, body of work. J.C. Jackson, now, he was a good player for the Patriots and he built himself into a starter. But realistically, you were paying him based on a season and a half that you now projected out and said, this is one of the top corners in the NFL. It's a risk. You do that when you look at draft picks and, you hear evaluators all the time. They look at quarterbacks and they go, you had one great season of success. And they're all treading lightly because they don't know if that really, any player who just maxes it out in one season, I don't know if you spend a first round draft pick on that guy, particularly a top end first round draft pick, which is essentially the free agency. In free agency, when you dole out a contract of that level, that's you're sort of spending your first round pick in free agency on a guy of that level because you can't sign everybody to a max level deal or an elite level deal at positions. And when you do, to me, that equates to spending, first round capital in free agency with that kind of money. You just don't do that on players that I think, A, don't have a big body work. And then B, I do think it's a red flag that the Patriots were letting him walk. There's a history here. How many players? Kyle Van Noy, Trey Flowers, Jamie Collins, Trent Brown. like how many guys do we need to see the Patriots go, yeah, go ahead, pay him. No problem. And then
Yeah.
they come back in 1 or 2 or 3 years, like Chandler Jones, right? They move on from Chandler Jones, and it just, there are so many high-end players that they feel okay living without, and then those players go elsewhere and don't really transform into what they were inside that Patriots defensive system.
And there's certainly complications to the Chandler Jones situation. He has
Right,
been released
yeah.
by the Raiders. I think important to acknowledge that. And as Jori just mentioned, that's 2 of the 3 teams that acquired somebody to try and help slow down Patrick Mahomes. The third is the Broncos releasing Randy Gregory, who got a 5-year, $70 million contract to play 10 games. I mean, to play 10, like Randy Gregory, Jori, it feels like he still has value somewhere in the open market to me.
Yeah, I would be shocked if he doesn't land somewhere. It'll be interesting to see if Dallas wants to pick him up if it's not for much based off the value. They initially offered him also a pretty similar deal in terms of compensation. They just didn't allow him the same sort of protection if he was suspended or missed a game for another reason. And so you have to wonder, that's where the coaches know him. I mean, there are a few other coaches around the league, whether it's like Cleveland, who doesn't really need defensive help, but they've got a defensive line coach there who was a linebackers coach when Randy was in Dallas. And some of these guys who I think he's worked with previously, I would guess are the most likely to take the risk, so to say, on him. It's also interesting because how much does he need to make, assuming he wants to play more this season, given that he's still making the money in Denver? So it shouldn't be an expensive situation. What I think would be interesting from a Dallas standpoint, and I know we're going to talk about Dan Quinn more later in the show, is that Dan Quinn really got to Randy in a way that allowed him to play at his best. He wasn't perfectly physically healthy, but in terms of his mental health, which has been a huge emphasis and huge relevance to his on-field availability throughout his career, I think DQ did understand how to use him. And so, I don't know, if you're the Cowboys and you have this deep defense, but you also saw you just lost Trayvon Diggs, guys can be lost easily. If he doesn't cost much, he's got an understanding of the system, and Dan Quinn already knows what Dan would call his superpowers are. Do you bring him back? I think that could be interesting. Sirab, do you think no?
Hell no, bring him back for sure.
Okay. I thought you were saying don't. I think knowing Randy personally pretty well, I spent a lot of time with him after his suspensions. I even talked to his psychologist for a story in 2020, which was one of the most meaningful stories I ever done. Best therapy appointment I ever had was with Randy's therapist for a story. But I think he needs to be in a place where the right structure is around him to succeed, even if he's at a better place right now. And I think the Cowboys know how to have that structure. And I don't think any team is going to necessarily pick him up if they don't feel like they can have that structure, and if Randy doesn't feel like the structure's there.
Yeah, if there's any sense of it's Dallas. I think it's Dallas and nobody else, honestly. And I understand that, when you talk about the Browns, I get the coaching connection there, but I think he needs ownership down. Okay. I think he needs Jerry Jones being like, we're happy to have you back. We want, this was, let's put, the acrimony that we had, that sort of, it was a messy ending in Dallas with the back and forth about what they were willing to agree to or not. And Randy played his part in making that messy as well. They can tuck that away. I think it makes sense for Dallas's defense in terms of, look, rotating in pass rushers,
right,
keeping guys fresh. And by the way, scheme flexibility. You can have, who knows who you can rotate inside. I mean, does this allow you to, some plays, those plays where you like to put Micah over the center, over, a guard, or, DeMarcus Lawrence. I think from a scheme standpoint, it would be great to add him to that mix. But again, to me personally, I only think this works in Dallas. I think everybody has to know him. I think the owner has to be invested. And I think, maybe Randy has a chip on his shoulder. When I went through Denver, I was watching practice, and it struck me that there were a couple of plays that Randy had kind of screwed up on. And I could see that the coaching staff was frustrated. They kind of called him out a couple of times for not being on the ball, so to speak, when it came to, alignments. I think he was offsides at one time. I think they were a little frustrated with it. And I thought to myself, I'm like, man, this has not been a productive player here. You got a new head coach who's coming in. He's going to get extremely frustrated if a player A isn't producing and B isn't at least lining up where he's supposed to line up, penalties, whatever it is. And then knowing Randy's history where, it takes a village with him. I don't know that Sean Payton was ever going to be on board with that long term. So this isn't a huge surprise to me, but I think Dallas to me makes sense.
I think the coaching staff part of this is part of this conversation, though, because Sean Payton is obviously coming in just He doesn't give a damn about any of it anyway. And I understand that raises questions about what they're going to do with Russ. It raises questions about how they're rebuilding. But like, I don't know that I understand right now what the point and purpose is in Denver. Like, I guess it's just I don't give a damn. I'm just going to rip this thing down to the studs anyway, get out of here, and we'll start worrying about it next year. But Jori, man, that's a hell of a crapshoot. I'm just saying that it just presumes that all of a sudden you can rip a roster down to the studs and rebuild it quickly, which is going to be the expectation for Sean Payton. Like, he can't kick everybody out of town and not be held accountable next year for who replaces him.
If what they're saying is accurate, which I think is probably the best explanation, they want to get the young guys time. And even if the young guys aren't ready to produce at the level that Randy is, something needed to change. And I actually thought Randy had more penalties than he did, but he did have 2 neutral zone infractions in Miami. And that's something that I feel like Sean probably really lost his cool with, and probably was also like coming to him at an emotional time when they're down by a lot, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that that's something he's going to have to work with where he goes. But yeah, I think in Denver, this is the first change that we're seeing on defense, but I don't think it will be the last. And I also think that you had the Bradley Chubb trade last year. I mean, they were already kind of doing this fire sale of their defense, but now you have a new coaching staff come in. And that's why, as much as Sean Payton is not off to a good start in Denver, you can't just keep rolling through all of these people. I mean, when you look at Chicago, it's like at some point you need to have a coach who can build something, and you need to have a plan, and you need to stick with it. And I do wonder how much GM Payton, as opposed to Coach Payton, is sticking with the plan that they had coming in. Because, I mean, C-Rob, do you think that George Payton no longer thinks that Randy was the best one for the defense? Or do you think this was a coaching staff being like, this is what we need to do?
I can't really speak to that dynamic at this point. This is Sean's team. Okay. We can talk as much as we want about, George Payton and Sean working together and everything. But when you bring in Sean the way that you do, when you pay him the money that you do, ultimately, it's going to come down to whether or not Sean wants a player there on that roster or not, and whether George Payton, he can work together on agreeing on an assessment of that player. To me, this smacks of Sean Payton. As you said, the neutral zone infractions. And then also, I think there's a base element of Sean when it comes to pass rushers. He knows, as an offensive play caller, pressure destroys scheme, right? So if Randy's making this money, and by the way, you're also looking on being on the hook for next year, or at least opening up that cap space next year, right? I mean, it's like $12-13 million next year, I think, off the top of my head. Sean's sitting there and he's going, if we're not getting sacks, right? The sack numbers have never been great for Randy, right? He's never had double-digit sacks. What's he maxed out at 6, I think, in the expanse of his career?
6.5, yeah.
Yeah, 6.5. Okay, so if you're not putting up double-digit sacks, if you're not going to be a 10, 12, 15 sack guy, you got to be, top 10 in pressures. You have to constantly be, in the backfield, making things happen. And I just don't think Randy really ever lived up to that in Denver. And I think even in Dallas, there was still an element of building into it. And I think when Denver signed him, they thought, hey, this timeline's going to continue. This curve, this growth is going to continue forward. And it didn't. And when you make some mistakes that frustrate a new head coach, and he's staring at younger players on the roster, and you started the way you did and you got blown out the way you did against Miami, this doesn't surprise me. I think, it may not even be the last player we see ultimately cut before the end of the season that surprises us.
But this is exactly why, it's rare that I'm really right about something. So I'm just going to keep tooting my horn as we came into this year. Kept telling everybody the Broncos were going to suck this year because Sean Payton is going to do what every coach that's a legend is done when they come back to a team. They come in with these high expectations of like, no, we're going to get fixed. And fans are like, it's going to be great. And then quickly you realize it's not. They're going to have to rip it apart. They're going to have to bring in their people. They're going to have to assert their culture. This happens like every time a coach comes back to the league that has been successful somewhere else. This is just like every Star Wars movie is the same. Sorry, Jori, you won't understand that reference. Apparently, I'm telling you, every time a coach comes back, it is the same exact plot. Like I can map it. I don't even need ways. I can get you from A to B on how this is all going to go. So we'll see what it.
Fitz really going out on a limb there. Broncos are going to suck this year. They're really going out.
No. Because there were plenty of people that are like, no, Sean Payton
This is the breaking news people come to this show for.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, people, you can't tell me now that there weren't national pundits that I was
Breaking
peers
news,
with.
team that gave up 70 points is not good. In one game.
Okay,
I called it before the season when everybody else was like, oh, they're going to be a sneaky playoff contender because Russ is going to get fixed with Sean Payton. I heard enough of that crap. I knew
I
it.
did think that was the case. I'll give you that.
Hallelujah, I called it. I'm just saying.
Okay. I guess maybe it's just because, myself, I was like, hey, look, I don't know about this whole turnaround in one season kind of thing. Like, now, did I think it was more probably like an 8-9 situation? Yeah, I did. But I do understand what you're saying. There was a lot of love for Sean Payton. There was a lot of ink spilled writing about, what he was going to be able to do there. And Sean had a lot to do with that. But look, if he's making moves like this, and again, I pin this on Sean, I'm curious to see what the team builds into as the stretch arrives, because I guess that experience of watching Mike McCarthy come in with Mike Nolan, and to see it not work in year one, all the injuries and just everything just smashed. But then as the season progressed and you got toward the end and you thought, okay, well, maybe if there's a replacement of the defensive coordinator here, maybe there are some things to work with. Really, year two is where the bounce happens. I still think that's on the table for Denver. I just don't know how many people you got to fire on the assistant coaching staff and how, high up those go. Is it a coordinator situation? And then B, the pieces and parts that you have to swap out before next season.
How much do y'all think this storyline will be on even more display this week with the Jets going to the Broncos, Nathaniel Hackett being back in town, and the Broncos clearly not being much better off than when he left?
Sure, nobody's going to talk. I'm sure the Jets reporters aren't going to ask Sean Payton about the comments.
I'm sure it will be fair and reasonably covered as a small story that nobody will overreact to, right? Like, it just feels like that New York, Sean Payton, nobody's going to that's going to be all the Sunday morning.
No, but I'm writing about this tomorrow, and I was talking to our boss, and he's like, well, Frank didn't think it was that big of a story now that Aaron Rodgers isn't in and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, it is still a big story.
They are both beat down.
It might not be as big of a story if Sean hadn't said what he said during training camp, but for him to say this might have been one of the worst coaching jobs ever. And, oh, by the way, he just had one of the historic losses ever. And as we talked about on the podcast last week, he wasn't willing to just own up to that. He was like, stop asking questions.
Well, wasn't Hackett 2-2 in week 4?
What happens here if the Jets just ram it down the Broncos' throats? Like, are we going to, if Zach Wilson looks like he's reclaimed and hallelujah, 2 straight weeks of media, that's 2 hallelujahs in this one show, 2 hallelujahs for Zach Wilson being suddenly, lights out against the Broncos. I do think that the shade's going to be, it's going to be dramatic. Okay. Speaking of the Jets, by the way, Aaron Rodgers says he wants to play this season again. Are we buying any of this? Like, C-Rob, news or noise?
I mean, I don't doubt that he wants to. Look, it'd be unprecedented. I don't know how to react to this because we've never seen anything like this happen before. And I know the whole speed bridge procedure, can move up the timeline. I was stunned to see him moving around the way that he was. It was funny because I'm like, this guy tore his Achilles. And I'm watching him move around on the sidelines and he's as mobile as I am for the first 3 hours of every day I wake up. And I don't have any Achilles tear.
I feel that I'm doing my plantar fascia stretches before I get out of bed and I'm 29 years old.
I'm like, my God. So, I mean, look, he seems to be, at least when you watch the doctors react to what they're seeing on film, with him moving around on the sidelines prior to that Chiefs game, they're pretty surprised by it. I'm surprised by it. I don't know what this means. I don't know if this means he will be back, let's say, for the playoffs. They would have to obviously be in that playoff picture for him to factor. He's talking like he thinks he can do it. Let's see. I will say this about him, and he's not going to showcase this, especially now. But there definitely was a period of time, just talking to people, that are in his circle. There was definitely a period of time he was extremely down about how everything unfolded. And it was not that long ago. I'm not talking about 3 weeks ago. I'm talking about, this might be a roller coaster where he's up and he's down, he's up and he's down. Now he goes obviously when he has his platform on the Pat McAfee show, I don't know that we're ever going to see the down Aaron, right? We're always going to see the up Aaron. We're going to see the feisty Aaron. We're going to see the Aaron who's taking shots at other NFL players over dumb stuff. If he does, I don't know if it's real or not, but if he does it, I will say that is a stunning turnaround by an athlete. And it makes me now wonder, is this now, remember when like ACLs, like there was times where we were like, oh, ACL's career is in jeopardy now. Like this could change, this player forever. And then Adrian Peterson came back from the ACL in record time and was still an all-world player. Now I'm starting to wonder, like, is this the next leap that we see medically with NFL players? We're now in Achilles, which became the new ACL. Like, oh my God, the Achilles is who knows how this will change their game. I'm curious if this is kind of a turning point for Achilles injuries.
Yeah, I don't doubt that he thinks it's possible and that he wants to, but I think there's a couple things going on here. First of all, like we're all well aware that coming back and being able to walk or maybe even jog, run, et cetera, is very different than being able to withstand an NFL tackle from a 300-pound man who's super athletic. Oh, and by the way, their offensive line isn't great. So I think there's that element. But I think to me, when he says this stuff, it's a matter of trying to fire up the team, trying to keep them together and say, look, I will do my part if you guys do your part. Because even if he were to come back in 4 months instead of 6 to 8, that still puts you after the regular season. And they need to be like good for him to come back. And he can't say that. I mean, he did kind of say like, we need to be alive for us to be having these conversations. But I just think that there's this element of he's 39 years old. And even if he comes back, the chance of re-entry, and I don't mean like another tear to his Achilles, but of having some sort of complication, like we saw it with Dak after he hurt his ankle, then he like strained his calf, like all of the things around it that are, your body is one machine working together, even if it's different muscles and ligaments and et cetera. And so do I think that he wants to come back? Yes. Do I think it's possible that physically he could get on the field? Yes. But I think it would be difficult for him to play at a high level. And I think it would be unrealistic to think that the risk that it would pose toward next year's team is worth it.
Also, I think to your point, Jori, we're only days removed from all the stories of, hey, he's reaching back out and coming to the sidelines and talking to the team because he wants everybody to stay focused. Like, this is his way of getting everybody to stay focused. And also, if there's ever been, we all have that friend that manifests, right? Like, now, for some people, I have some very successful friends that are big believers in manifesting. Like, I'm going to speak it into existence. I've also got some just absolutely lazy lump on a log friends that are like, I'm speaking it into existence. So there's a happy medium on all this. Like, I can manifest being a starting center on an NBA championship team all damn day. It ain't going to get me there. But if there's ever been somebody that is like in the friend group that's like, I'm manifesting, I'm coming, like this is Aaron Rodgers.
What if you manifest being Woody from Toy Story? I think you can get there.
You know what? Wait, here's a real question. If I'm Woody, does C-Rob then get to be Buzz? Because that's where I draw the line. Like, I can't have somebody else on the show be the cool guy in this. Like, if I'm going to be the dorky guy, then
why is Woody not cool? Woody is cool.
No,
why is Woody cool? I mean, he's a lanky, doofy looking, like long-faced cowboy that doesn't really, like, he just sort of yells, "You're a toy!" And the Buzz Lightyear has all like the buttons and you can fly away. And like Buzz is yoked. Like, come on.
I'm the John Ratzenberger. I'm always the John, whatever. I'm always the John Ratzenberger character. Okay. So I'm the pig with the cork. All right. That's me. I'm always talking a little roundish.
That's amazing.
Real quick though, I do want to say one thing about Rodgers, and I was talking to somebody there, and I know he's upset that it got out that he talked to the team about keeping it together, like keeping it in house and support. But I'm telling you, that might have been underplayed. Like, just from talking to somebody in the organization, the impact that actually had on the team, with Aaron being like, hey, we got to pull together here. Like, we have to, like, we can't be pointing fingers. And like, the person I talked to was just like, you have no idea. Because last year, when this started to happen, it flew apart. Like, it was so bad, and it was allowed to go unchecked. And this guy walked in there, and like, the way it was put to me was, I don't know who else you could have walked into the room that would have commanded all these guys sitting there and actually looking at themselves and going, this dude's right. Like, we can't do this. Like, we actually have something here that could still work. We have to figure out a way to make that happen. And it's not going to happen by leaking and talking about, how the quarterback's not getting it done and now the defense is frustrated and all this stuff. Like, it was wild to me the way this person just said, like, I don't know who else you could have walked in the room and had players really take it to heart.
Aaron's speech, I have a lot of questions about what he said in it because, so to paint this picture for y'all, we're at the game Sunday night. It's like close to midnight. They almost beat the Chiefs and then they didn't. Some guys were like, it's a moral victory, but it's not, but we can build off this. And we played winning football other than a few plays. And then I asked Zach Wilson at his press conference, I'm like, what did Aaron say to the team and how did that message resonate? And Zach tells us the message was stick together, that like, we've had all these outside criticism and we need to stick together. So then we walk over to the locker room and I ask Randall Cobb this question and he's kind of telling me similarly. He's like, it's more about like the message that like the morale that it gave us and sort of just this lift, kind of what you're saying, C-Rob. He's like, but also I don't want to take anything away from Zach. Like he did not, even Randall Cobb, one of Aaron's best friends, did not want to go so far as to say like, give Aaron credit for what Zach did today. It was more about the team than like Zach's play in particular. Yeah. And then I asked Center Connor McGovern this question, wide receiver Alan Lazard, like multiple guys, and they were being kind of weird, like, oh, I think we'll keep that in-house. Or like Alan Lazard was like, did someone answer this question already? And the more they said this, when I'm like, it seemed like Zach had a pretty clear, like, stick together is not a controversial message. And Aaron Rodgers even went on the Pat McAfee show this week and was like, we need to stop having media leaks. And I'm like, the leak was that you told them to stick together. That is not controversial, sir. But I think it made me wonder if part of that stick together message included a, hey, I see you guys coming after each other on the sideline. I know what Joe Namath said. Like, screw what he said, screw what you guys were doing. And like, we have options. And so I think then you take that morale, you get a moral victory, so to say, or as close as you can get one. And the bigger question is, can that momentum carry you for more than 1 week? But I think what helps them is the fact that they're about to play a terrible defense. And so if you're playing a terrible defense and Zach Wilson can do this one more time, then you start rolling the ball and it works. If they were about to play Buffalo, I think it'd be hard for them to keep this momentum rolling.
They were pissed about Namath. I can tell you that. They were not happy that this guy who's not there doing anything, is just absolutely takes a flamethrower to Zach. And definitely, and I know we got to move on here. There was a bent, I think, in terms of like Aaron, that is not unfamiliar to the rest of us, where it's like, the media and the outside, and they're coming out and they're here to tear us apart. And they're, like, we need to, this is about us. It's about our thing. Keep it inside. This is, handle it here. This is the family. They're not the family. They want to destroy the family.
Yeah, I mean,
that kind of a thing.
For a million different ways, Aaron Rodgers has made a career in the last several years of shadowboxing ghosts. They, without naming who they are. So it doesn't surprise me at all that it would come into they. We'll have plenty of time to break down Zach Wilson because we do need to figure out if he's for real. But I think time will give us the answer to that. I got to get your thoughts on another huge story as we're bouncing around some of the biggest stuff happening across the NFL, because I think while Zach Wilson playing well was a surprise, one of the pleasant surprises in the early portion of this season to me has been that the Colts have been a lot better than I expected. So Jonathan Taylor removed from the PUP list, practices Wednesday. I mean, I'm watching an Anthony Richardson that so far in a few games has been a little bit like what he was at Florida. There have been great moments throwing the ball. There have been meh moments throwing the ball. But you're looking at an athlete that can make a million different plays, a million different ways. And they've even won games with Gardner Minshew and no Jonathan Taylor. So, like, do we think Jonathan Taylor is on the cusp of playing again for the Colts, C-Rob?
I would be surprised. I don't. His issue is not with Richardson. His issue is with the owner. His issue is with his money. His issue is with how this was all treated in the preseason. His issue is with Jim Irsay tweeting out a message about himself and Jonathan Taylor in this weird, wonky, hey, we don't matter kind of vibe. That's not what a player wants to hear from his owner, even if his owner is including himself in there. So I don't know that any of this has really changed. I think maybe the one factor is that now he's seen what the product looks like on the field without him. He's seen what this kid can bring to the table. And I don't think he would lie to himself and think that, wow, this offense could be, it's already had moments where you're like, wow, it's pretty kind of an exciting offense. Like Richardson, when he's not getting rocked because he's, putting himself out there to take hits, the kid's got the goods. Like, we see where that ceiling is, and it looks very reachable right now. And Taylor could play a big part in that. But again, if he wants to play a big part in it, I think he wants to know what's going to happen contractually. Now, the one thing that maybe has changed externally is I don't know where he can go now because Miami.
Not Miami.
Yeah, Miami. Now, I will say this, and we'll talk about Green Bay later. Green Bay, like there's a reason why I think Green Bay was interested in him, and I still think that reason stands. And so, that is one avenue that I think is still out there in terms of the Packers, but not for the compensation that Indianapolis was ultimately looking for. And I would say it's gotten more complicated for him externally as opposed to internally, because I don't know that there's just an easy landing spot for him the way where it looked like Miami was such a sensible move at the time.
Yeah, I was talking to someone involved with one of the teams here, and they were just like, it's a little bit wild how much Jonathan Taylor and his agent miscalculated the market and just miscalculated when to take their swing, because it's always going to be hard to have this leverage as a running back, but particularly right now, it's just unrealistic. And we've seen guys who have both been healthier than him in recent years and more productive than him in the last 2 years when you include last year. And I just don't know what he can do. And so I think that this at this point is about ego, because I don't think he's helping his value by not playing anymore. I don't think he's helping it for this year or for next year. And so the question is, can he just say like, look, this is an ownership issue. I'm going to do what I can with this current staff. I'm going to do what I can, even if he's doing it internally to prove to other teams the type of contract they could try and come after him for, because I don't know that the Colts are going to franchise tag him. I mean, maybe, but I think he has a good chance of getting out of there after this year. But I don't see, barring a huge injury, who is going to give the Colts what they want for him. And so I think in his best interest this year and in the long term, it's just to go back and play and be like, look, you guys are my team. I don't want to deal with Jim.
Well, and I can tell you straight up, the organization's opinion on this is the last time they saw an agent and a running back miscalculate what was going on in the market and externally like this was Le'Veon Bell. Okay. And the Steelers, like that's how they are processing this. They're like, look, you could completely screw up your career at this point. And I would say they're different runners. It's different situations. Taylor can probably go elsewhere and still have plenty of success, whereas maybe Le'Veon was more built for the way the Steelers schemed and what that line was. That's how they're processing this. And that's certainly the message they want to get across to Taylor, that, the options are not what you think they are. And the best play is let's get through 2023 and see if we can revisit this in the off season. But I won't rule that out. Okay. But I do think that message would have to resonate at some point, either with his agent or with Jonathan Taylor or both.
And the other thing is, if I'm Shane Steichen or Jim Bob Cooter, their head coach and their offensive coordinator, like that's who Jonathan needs to have the relationship right now with, because one, they might be able to convince him, like, look what we can do for you in your role. And two, if he goes off and they really like him, they're the ones who are going to be able to convince ownership and the front office to give him the deal. Like ownership and front office have not shown they're wanting to, but the coaching staff, if they really feel like he is key to them going to the next level, might be able to.
Take a drink if you care, as we got the name of the best offensive coordinator in the entire NFL in there. Not the best offensive coordinator, but the best name. Jim Bob Cooter is by far the best named coach in the entire NFL. There is no doubt about it. It's fun to say. The only thing I would add to this is I think you're both right about the miscalculation of the market. Where that becomes inexcusable is what the market looked like this year. Like, it's okay if there hasn't been a free agent running back in 10 years that's done what you've done. And, oh, my God, we're going to go test the market. This year alone, when Saquon didn't have a market and Josh Jacobs didn't have a market, at some point, you got to look at Jonathan Taylor. You got to look in the mirror. And no matter what your crew's telling you, no matter what your friends are telling you, no matter what your buddies are telling you got to look in the mirror. And you got to realize that there's a little bit of Spider-Man meme with all of it. So the miscalculation of the market is not only are his agents to blame, but I think Jonathan Taylor's to blame for at some point not realizing, hey, this market is like, I can think my house is worth $1 million, but if every other house on my street is selling for $200,000, at some point, I got to look at the real data happening right now. And the real data told them that this was a miscalculation. So I don't just blame the miscalculation. I blame the stubbornness and the unwillingness to admit the miscalculation for being where we are right now.
Yeah. And I mean, Eckler too, right? Because there was the whole trade me.
Yeah.
That was a failure. And then I think, look at some of the other younger guys out there. I mean, look, Miami is sitting there going, well,
yeah, so we're good.
We're good. We invested in a young, cheap guy, super fast, and we got a rotation here that works. And I think even where it worked, right? So David Montgomery in Detroit, where we would look at that and go, hey, now it makes sense how they turned over a successful backfield. But then when you watch David Montgomery go out and just wear a team out, it makes sense. But David Montgomery didn't sign. It wasn't like he blew it up in terms of like the finances. It sucks. But I don't know how you change this unless he comes back into the fold and he does what McCaffrey is doing right now, what Christian McCaffrey is doing in San Francisco. If he can insert himself into an MVP level conversation, obviously you're not going to do that with the games he missed, but if he plays at an MVP level the rest of the season, then I think a team has to reassess how they're ultimately valuing what he brings to the table. But that's where running backs are, I think, at this point. You want that big deal. You really want that kind of a contract. You have to play at an MVP level, even if you're never going to win it. You have to play at that level to get the contract, I think.
And one quick bow I want to put on this before we move on. You mentioned Eckler, who, by the way, has now missed time to injury. You mentioned Saquon. I mentioned Saquon, who is missing time to injury. And Josh Jacobs, who has not looked anything this year so far like he did last year. We'll see if that normalizes. It's not all his fault. But realistically, the three guys that we just said, hey, here's the proof of concept for what the market bears, are all now having a down moment. Like, it's going to be interesting. Even if Jonathan Taylor comes in, will he be Jonathan Taylor? I don't know. Speaking of will he be a shell of himself, I'm going to ask a hot question to two people much smarter than I am. All right. I understand it's sacrilegious to say anything negative about Bill Belichick, but can we acknowledge that the Patriots suck, right? The Patriots aren't any good and their quarterback's not good, right? So the Patriots just aren't good. And I know that Bill Belichick has accomplished great things, but I'm trying to figure out what to do with the fact that the Patriots right now aren't good. And as I've said to you both a million times, and to everybody that will ever listen, if it's a talent issue, Bill Belichick brought in the talent. Like there has to be some level of when you shopped for the ingredients and you made the cake and the cake sucks, at some point, everybody's going to look at you. And even if you've been the best baker in the world, eventually the bakery shop guy is like, you lost it. I'm not saying like, C-Rob, we're not allowed to say Bill's on the hot seat. But like in a hypothetical world, do the Patriots need to start thinking about what's next?
I think we can say he's on the hot seat. I think it's okay now. I mean, look, he suffered a career worst loss, right? So you come out of that.
wrote about this, but he still just mumbled it as if he's like afraid to say it out loud.
Kraft 2 off seasons in a row says,
yeah,
look, I want to win. Like this is the standard is winning. And then he says it 2 off seasons ago. Then this last off season owners meetings, I think he went further in saying, like, when he's talking about the Don Shula record, where he's like, and I'm paraphrasing here, he'd like to see him break it, but we don't talk about wanting to see players reach certain stats. We're about winning. Yeah, we're about winning. That's what the organization's about. And they're not there right now. And as I tweeted out on Sunday, when you compare Bill Belichick's record with Tom Brady starting games versus the period of his career, both with the Patriots and the Browns, with Tom Brady not starting games, he's kind of the same guy as the Cleveland Browns, Bill Belichick. I mean, he's close to a 500 coach at best, and it's actually sub 500 when you look at that record. That's not, we treat assistants, when assistants would leave New England, we would sit there and go, well, that's what you get. You left Tom Brady, you left the nest, and then you come back after it fails. Well, Bill Belichick kind of left the nest. He left the Tom Brady nest, right? Just like all those assistants did. And now we're starting to see what the foibles are as a general manager, what the foibles are as a head coach, with him trying the Matt Patricia thing, which maybe that knocked Mac Jones off his access forever. I think at some point, Robert Kraft's got to look at this and he's got to do the math in his head. How long do I let this play out? If we go through 2023 and it's a 5-12 season, we have a massive, immense, insane amount of cap space going into next season. Like, are we gonna tell Bill, the general manager, go ahead, like fill that cap space and let's see where we can ultimately, we know how that worked out last time. It was about a 50-50 proposition, whether the player was a solid player or just a complete bust in the system. It's a lot to think about. And as I wrote, like, for Kraft, there's not a lot of playbooks on this because you just don't have a coach at this level that you have to figure out how to part company. You saw Wayne Huizenga had to do it with Don Shula. We saw, the Rooney family had to do it with Chuck Noll. And then we saw Jerry Jones, who had to do it with Tom Landry. But those were all different circumstances. Jones comes in, buys a team, dismisses Landry in a way that's messy, and he goes on to regret it at times. The fan base that loved Landry always remembered it. But then when you look at the Noll and Shula situations, it was the owner basically pushing and getting involved in the kitchen of those coaches to the point where they wanted staff changes. And you had two historic coaches going, not going to do that. Not going to sell out my friends at this point. I would rather just retire and walk. In a way, to me, that seems like the most easily solvable way if Bill really is on the downslope and is not going to recover, is Robert Kraft sitting down with him and saying, got to bring in a general manager that you're going to report to. Got to bring in some different assistant coaches, want you to get rid of these guys. And Bill going, nah, I don't need to do that. I'll go coach somewhere else. I don't need to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for two reasons. One, the Patriots specifically, you have to think about if Belichick is no longer going to be in the position he's in now, both as head coach, as de facto GM, as head defensive guy, who else is coming with him? They have a safeties coach named Brian Belichick. They have a linebackers coach named Steve Belichick. I don't think those guys are staying without Dad. And I think you also it seems like Bill would take some sort of shot on the way out in terms of this is like a divorce between him and Robert Kraft, as you were kind of writing, C-Rob, rather than as him getting fired or him not being the guy anymore. But I think more broadly beyond the Patriots, you have to ask yourself, in this NFL era that is so skewed toward offense, can you have a defensive head coach when you don't have the right quarterback in place? Now, when he had Tom Brady, he was fine because he had the right quarterback. The system was working. Maybe what was needed from an offensive standpoint wasn't the same, but now he doesn't seem to have that guy, or at least not someone who has proven he's that guy. And so is Bill Belichick the right coach for the Patriots with Mac Jones? And if you're going to a new quarterback, well, what kind of coordinator are you getting him? And I mean, no knock on Bill O'Brien, but it's just sort of the system isn't working anymore. The personnel decisions on the offensive side of the ball have not been panning out, as C-Rob wrote about. And so it really makes you wonder, but then also, I mean, where do you think he would be most likely to go next? Because, okay, let's say Chicago needs a new coach. Well, they're probably then also looking for a new quarterback and certainly someone who could be that top guy. I mean, maybe you can lure another great offensive coordinator from somewhere because, okay, Belichick's going to do defense. You let this guy do offense and you get to be the top offensive mind. But also with Belichick, is anyone else ever the top anything mind?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, let's be honest. I think now it looks like the best offensive coach he ever had was Tom Brady, right? The quarterback at that
100%.
level. Yeah, quarterback at that level is always supposed to be an extension of the coaching staff, right? And he was a hard ass. He ground players to a pulp. He had a high level of expectation. He knew the offense in and out. He was probably the best offensive coach that Bill Belichick's ever had. So you can't take Tom Brady, like whoever else he brings, whether it's O'Brien or anybody else, you can't bring Tom Brady back to be that offensive coach. Which is probably the split. That's the successful split. I'm Bill. I'm going to run the defense. I'm going to work on all the details. I'm going to find the loopholes. Tom knows what the offense needs to be, and he's going to run that entire thing. I think the question you have to ask when you say, Jori, like, where else could he go? It's twofold. Number one, first look at New England and think, okay, he's leaving. If you're New England, like the whole building was hired by Bill. What the hell are you going to do now? Like, you're literally taking apart everything. Like everything leads to Bill. So if he leaves, this is a reset like we've never seen before because it's the number of employees that ultimately rested on yay or nay, Bill making that decision or a Bill subordinate, a lieutenant making the decision. It's insane. The strip down that New England ultimately will eventually have to go through when, they part company with Bill Belichick. But then extending that out, where does he go? I don't know what franchise is on board. I would assume that still has to be the way it works if Bill goes to the next franchise. So what franchise sits there and goes, Bill's going to come in. It's all, he's the GM. He's hiring everybody. You'd be bringing in the exact thing that is the reason he's being let go, right? Like, you'd have to say, hey, everything because he wouldn't work for somebody else. He would bring all these people in. To me, C-Rob would be like the definition of insanity. Like, you're just bringing him in because you want your fans to be excited about the name at that point. Well, how bad is your
And I think
franchise
beyond that, it's like when we look at what all of the Belichick assistants have struggled to do in other places, and obviously there are some like Mike Vrabel who have had success, but the same way that taking his culture elsewhere didn't work for a lot of people, I don't think you can guarantee that Bill Belichick, at that point at 72 years old, starting off, will have success implementing his culture elsewhere, even if he has his name.
And if we're being honest about Vrabel, like Vrabel was that's a Bill O'Brien guy. He's on the Bill O'Brien tree. Like he played for Belichick and like he learned, I get it. Like he learned a lot of what his foundation, his fundamentals were by being inside the Patriot program. But I mean, really, he came of age as an assistant ultimately with Bill O'Brien. And I do think that ultimately matters. And man, this is just the mess. Like this is about as messy as I think it could be. And I hesitate to say that because I'm like, we're 4 games in. And whenever I say stuff like this, whenever I sit there and go, okay, they only beat the Jets, but they did kind of play close games in the other 3 losses. This is when it turns around and the Patriots end up 12-5 and I look like a total ass. But I don't see it with Mac Jones. I just don't.
Yeah, it's hard to picture.
Well, check the article out in the Yahoo Sports app, obviously. I'm excited to read it, and I think it's a bunch of tough questions that the whole league is going to be asking about a Hall of Famer that can be a Hall of Famer for what he's accomplished, but it doesn't mean that what he's accomplishing today is enough. Before we get out of here, one more thing we got to get into, and it's the game of the week. I know, C-Rob, you're going to be there. Cowboys taking on the 49ers, but here's what's interesting to me, and I really want to get both of y'all's thoughts on this because, Jori, you know this Cowboys team incredibly well. And I'm looking at the Cowboys, and every week I'm hearing Dan Quinn, Dan Quinn, Dan Quinn. I'm looking at the Cowboys right now in that defense, and I'm asking myself, like, is Dan Quinn suddenly becoming a head coaching candidate again? I know it didn't go right the first time, but we've seen plenty of coaches get a second chance, and as good as that Cowboys defense is, other than the weird hiccup against Arizona, I wonder if there's steam, even though we're in an offensive league now.
I think the word suddenly is where I would disagree. He's been a head coaching candidate now going into his 3rd offseason this year. And last year, he chose not to pursue a lot of the opportunities. And the year before that, there were the positions he wanted, he didn't get. And then he chose to take himself out of the running for some of the others. And I mean, this is a guy who I think has changed the way he coaches, both from a scheme standpoint and a management standpoint. And he's someone who came in, this defense was not doing well. They were not doing well on the field. I mean, they were one of like the worst run defenses and scoring defenses in 2020. And then he comes in and all of a sudden they just skyrocket up. They've led the league in takeaways the last 2 years, which no longer seems like a fluke. I mean, they're the first team to repeat that title since the Steelers in 1972 to 1974. And they have a chance to do it again this year for the 3rd year. And I think what's most impressive from a scheme standpoint is he is saying, okay, every single player, what can they do? What else can they do? And how can I scheme them in a way that allows them to play very versatily? And that's why I love this Shanahan-Quinn matchup this weekend, which besides for them being former colleagues when Dan was the head coach in Atlanta and Kyle was his offensive coordinator, Kyle is known for almost this positionless football on offense, and Dan has really started to do that on the defensive side of the ball of how many different ways can you keep the other team guessing about if Micah Parsons is going to play on the edge or if he's going to play linebacker, if Leighton Vander Esch this year is linebacker or he's going to rush, if Jaron Kearse is going to be your safety or he's going to be your linebacker. And that has really helped. That element of disguise and surprise has really helped what the defense has been able to do. So I would say that I definitely think he will garner head coaching interest again this offseason. I think, again, going back to our question, let's say there was a Chicago interest. Well, does that make sense if they need to start over at quarterback? I don't know. I mean, maybe they just need an adult in the room. No, like, with all due respect to Matt Eberflus, not in the sense that he's not an adult, but like he does not have a handle on what's going on in that organization right now. I think that's pretty indisputable, at least from the public perception. And so maybe you want someone like that, but I think you're really going to have to think about what kind of franchise has the right structure to hire a defensive head coach, even one who's had the success that Dan Quinn has had.
That's a good point. I mean, he was the runner-up in Denver, right? And it was close. It was really close. When they hired Nathaniel Hackett over Quinn, it was extremely close. And I think ultimately what tipped it was they thought they were getting Aaron Rodgers. So they're going to get an Aaron Rodgers guy, and that's what
I think.
I think if they didn't think they were getting Aaron Rodgers, I think they would have ended up hiring Dan Quinn, and we would maybe be talking about a different story in Denver right now. Jori hit it perfectly. He's absolutely going to be a hot candidate. He's absolutely, I think, worth it. Knowing kind of how things unraveled in Atlanta was unfortunate. there were struggles with the front office. I think Arthur Blank did a really poor job of managing relationships in the building and just trying to keep things sorted out. The 53 was up for grabs. It went from Thomas Dimitroff to Dan Quinn. I think that created some awkwardness in the building. But the funny thing was, even when it all unraveled there, even when there was an opportunity for everybody to stab each other in the back, when that whole entire Atlanta operation fell apart, Quinn was the one guy who I was like, wow, like no one is killing. Like even guys that could have tried to have some kind of a beef with him, we're just like, Dan's a great guy. Like it sucked the way it went. We all wanted to make it work. And, it was, there were some awkward times about, who was making decisions with the 53 and what players we were using and where we wanted to go personnel wise. But Dan's a great guy. And it was unfortunate that we couldn't all get it done. You don't see that often about a coach like that. And I don't know. I mean, when you sit there and you look externally, like what makes sense for him, I think it would have to be a franchise where you have a veteran level quarterback who you can afford to rotate out offensive coordinators with that guy. You have to have a quarterback who is on a level where he can function and play at a high level and in a way teach the next coordinator who comes in to work with him, because all those high level quarterbacks, the best ones, are going to constantly lose offensive coordinators over the expanse of their careers. So I don't know. I think you'd have to, the Chargers? I mean, like, do you do it again if you're the Chargers? Are
Dan
you like
Quinn and Kellen Moore with the Chargers?
Yeah, I mean, does that?
But that's what I think is also interesting because you make a good point. I talked to some coaches about this in the offseason where it's like, or during my training camp tour, where it's sort of, if you're hiring a defensive coach, you have to know that if you have success, you're going to keep losing your offensive coordinator. Even in Philly, it's interesting because Nick Sirianni is an offensive guy, but he's chosen not to call the plays, which has worked very well for them. But they lost Shane Steichen last year, and they might lose Brian Johnson after this year if things continue on the pace that they are. And so whether it's offensive or defensive, having your head coach call plays, while it might shift the way you need to do your management responsibilities, is a huge advantage for continuity on offense, which is a huge advantage for advancing in the postseason.
Management responsibilities always comes into my mind when you see second-time coaches. And I'll just go back to talking to Jack Del Rio years ago when we were working on the same shows. And I asked him the biggest difference between the first time he was a head coach and the second time he was a head coach. And he said, man, the first time you hold on to everything with a vice grip, like everything matters. And he told me this hysterical story about he flipped out one day because the toilet paper wasn't right in one of the bathrooms. And he was just so worked up about every little detail. And he said the biggest difference was the second time he realized that how important delegation was going to be to let him connect to men in the locker room. And because he had a better understanding of that, it made him a better head coach his second time around. Now, still fired, obviously, but I think sometimes what fans do is they see a second-time coach and they think, why are we hiring this bum? It didn't work the first time. He's a retread. I just think we have to all realize that head coach is a far different job than offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator. And sometimes you get such a limited run the first time, and then you have that chance to reset and you realize, man, I could have done this, and this different. So second-time head coaches, I think, can be a great hire for an organization because they have the opportunity to learn from what they did wrong the first time, as much as fans want fresh and new all the time.
Yeah, Pete Carroll once called it big room, small room. He was, he's like, you have to know how to, you go from running small rooms and managing small rooms and having like one-on-one relationships to running big rooms and having to have relationships across an entire organization. And the initial failures of that are exactly what you said, Fitz, where you're literally trying to still handle everything, and you're not you can't be a handle everything guy anymore. No one can truly function like that. You have to learn to delegate. And that was one of the things that he talked about with like John Schneider, with the Seahawks. It's like, trust John, I trust him. We trust each other. He knows what I can handle on my end. I know what he can handle on his end. You delegate that trust to different individuals, and then you share in the success later. But you can't be micromanaging everything on personnel, on like biz ops. I mean, there's even coaches that like, I think some come in and make mistakes on even like the business side. They're pissed at some of the things that are going on. And that makes no sense. I should never be on biz ops as a coach.
Yeah, but Fitz, you make a great point because I worked on a story with Dan Quinn about this and how he wants to be a head coach again, or at least when we worked on the story going into the 2022 season he did. And what you were saying is so true, is that if he becomes a head coach again, he is very committed to delegating more than he did the first time, both in terms of, again, the scheme standpoint and just who's doing what from a coaching responsibilities. And what I thought was super interesting is he got fired after 5 weeks into the 2020 season. And he kind of spent that rest of the year being like, what do I need to change? Reviewed, I think it was 2013 to 2020, all the film cutouts of how his defense had evolved and how it hadn't. And then he also asked all these people, whether it was players, whether it was coaches, front office people, what can I do to be better? Please be honest with me. It just made this whole list. And the biggest thing, again, was you're trying to do too much and you're not doing any of it in the way that you need to do. And I think that, as you mentioned with Del Rio, when you come in that first time, you need to prove like, I deserve this job. I have the power. I have that authority over the team. And once you come back, you're like, I know that's not what it's about. And that's not necessarily what's going to empower me and my team to win. And so you just sort of can take the ego out a little bit. And I definitely think that Dan has showed that in spades in his time with the Cowboys.
Leave the toilet paper to somebody else.
That's always fair advice.
I don't know. I think that's one you should probably hold on to.
I mean, in my mind's eye, as rich as football teams are, they all have glorious toilet paper. I don't know. Yeah. You can give us the scoop
Fitz,
from the game.
you have to go out of this episode saying, and now that's a wrap for this episode.
Oh my God. All right. Obviously, enjoy the game. C-Rob, tell everybody how they can continue to support Terez Paylor's legacy.
Yeah, always. If you could please check out breakingtea.com/Terez. That's capital T and Breaking Tea. We got the All Juice tees and hoodies for sale there with the new design. Remember that all proceeds from that purchase go to support the Terez Paylor Scholarship at Howard University. You can also donate directly to that scholarship, as well as the one in his name at Missouri, if you check out our podcast description.
You should also check all of us out on Twitter at Charles Robinson, at Jori Epstein. I'm at Jason Fitz. You know that. Stone doing God's work behind the glass. At SJ Rochelle is how you get to Stone. And I'll tell you, if you haven't checked out the Yahoo Sports app, go out, check it out. We got a lot of great stuff out there. As you've heard, Charles got an article out there. Both Jori and Charles they're doing all the work. I just sit here and look pretty in front of a microphone. Trust me, if you're listening, just trust me, I look pretty.
We pull the string in Fitz's back, and he says, "There's a snake in my boot."
Oh, man. To infinity and beyond. Leave us a 5-star review. Let us know what you think of the new show, obviously, and let us know what you think of the toilet paper wherever you are. That's the most important part of it. Check out all the shows we're doing across the network, of course. And remember, we're going to be back next Wednesday with more inside coverage for everybody that works on this show behind the scenes. We thank you for taking the time to hang out with us. Have a great week.